Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the first Prague Insecurity Conference. We had a terrific day of discussion yesterday, destabilizing the conventional wisdom on topics ranging from international society to populism and the role of socioeconomic insecurity in geopolitical change. Today, we have our War and Order Day, and we're starting with a provocative keynote address from Professor Andrew Moravcsik of Princeton University. Much like when introducing yesterday's keynote speaker, I don't really have to introduce Andrew Moravcsik because we all know who Andrew Moravcsik is. I can safely say that everybody in this room has read Andrew's work for a long time. For the last 25 years, Andrew has been at the cutting edge of research into the European Union, and we have all read, engaged, and indeed critiqued the work that he's done. And when I recently referred to Andrew on Facebook as a critical scholar, he reacted with some surprise. But if indeed our notion of critical is to challenge received wisdoms, to challenge conventional thinking, and to attack the issues of the world with normative purpose, then sorry to say, Andrew, but indeed you fit that bill. And we see it's just such an address this morning that's lined up. A note of optimism, perhaps, amidst some of the angst and doom and gloom that we perhaps discussed yesterday. Why populist foreign policies are doomed to fail. So I'll hand over to Andrew, and then we have an excellent lineup of respondents to challenge, engage, and take on Andrew's thoughts on that. We have Nadine Godhardt from the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, SVP to its friends. We have Gianpaolo Di Paola, former Italian defense minister and former CMC of NATO, and we have Matt Koenig of the Atlantic Council and Georgetown University. So there'll be plenty of critical engagement of the critical, and that's indeed what we seek to do at this Prague Insecurity Conference. So please join me this morning in welcoming Professor Andrew Moravcsik.
Let me again thank Ben for organizing such a great conference, which is also, as you can tell from the name, a chance for me to return to what was originally the country of my forefathers, although as you see from the spelling, via several centuries in Hungary, and then the latest generation coming to the United States. I don't know if I'm critical or critical of the critical or critical of the critical of the critical, but I'm going to try to say something provocative today, and that is that populist foreign policies, based on the evidence of the last year, are doomed to fail. So let me be very precise about what I'm going to argue. Populist leaders have failed to implement most of the concrete policies that they promised. Instead, they've adopted their predecessors' policies. Now, fail to implement. What do I mean by fail to implement? I'm not just saying that politicians have promulgated policies and those policies haven't achieved the wonderful overarching goals that they said they would. That's true of all political promises. I'm saying they haven't even implemented strictly speaking, the policies they said they would. Indeed, they have done the opposite. They have critiqued their predecessors and then done exactly the same thing. Now the question is also why? So the title of the talk is not populist foreign policies are failing or have failed, but they are doomed to fail. So I will argue not just that populist politicians have not implemented their policies, but that they cannot implement their policies. And the fact that they cannot implement their policies lies in the very nature of populism itself. So what I'm going to do is look at American and British policy, Trump and Theresa May's administrations, issue by issue. I'm going to argue that they've failed to implement what they said they were going to implement almost totally. And then I'm going to explain why by looking at why the nature of the populist promises that they made are unfulfillable by those people. So let's start with Trump's turnarounds. So President Trump is a good example of a populist leader who's implemented almost none of his concrete promises and positions. The foreign policy of the United States today, almost 1 year into the Trump administration, more than a year since the election, more closely resembles Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's proposals and policies than it does what he promised in the election. So let's just go issue by issue through Trump's foreign policy over the last year and see how that works. So we can start with Afghanistan. Ever since 2012, Trump has said that the war in Afghanistan is a mistake. He viciously criticized Obama for pursuing that war and sending American troops there. He quieted down a little in the election campaign because it was a hot topic, but when he got to the White House, he pushed the issue in meeting after meeting. So no decision was taken in the administration until August, when, due to military opposition and also the realization that losing a war on his watch would be politically unwelcome, he agreed to increase American troop strength in Afghanistan from 8,000 to 12,500 or 13,000 troops. Let's turn to China. This was one of the first promises that Trump broke. He said in the campaign over and over again that he would label the Chinese currency manipulators, that he would punish them for doing so and force them to change. He linked that to trade policy and so on. Within weeks of coming into office, he was cozying up to China. By April, he was saying, well, actually, China isn't a currency manipulator, because Trump realized, first of all, that his judgment that China was a currency manipulator was at least 2 or 3 years out of date. But also, as he said quite honestly, he needed Chinese help to deal with the Korean crisis. He even ruefully said in that speech, you know, being president of the United States is different than just being a private citizen. Let's go on. Japan, Trump voiced the view in the campaign that it was okay if the United States removed its military presence and military protection from Japan. It was even okay if Japan went nuclear. And that policy just disappeared without a trace. We have no evidence of that whatsoever. Then we have NATO. So Trump said we should reconsider American commitments to NATO, that the Europeans weren't paying their way. In any case, it wasn't a primary interest of the United States to defend them. They were free riders. This, of course, is not unique to Trump. Every American president says this. And again, within less than a month, he had reversed policy. I remember this because I was at the establishment non-critical foreign policy meeting in Munich last February, and there came Vice President Pence saying, in the name of the President of the United States, I can tell you we are committed to NATO. And they sent out cabinet ministers to reassure NATO of that fact. Then we have Korea. So I think we see from the last week, Trump was bitterly critical of Clinton-Obama policies on Korea, but he is stuck with exactly the same options in Korea, and we see that now that Kim Jong-un has actually launched something that might be an intercontinental ballistic missile. It's not like there's some new military option we didn't know about. He did exactly what previous administrations have done, which is tone down the rhetoric and look quietly, reportedly, for diplomatic solutions. Then there's TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now here it can be said that Trump did actually change policy. What can't be said is that there's anything unique about Trump changing that policy. That was the election position of Hillary Clinton for at least 6 months before the election as well. That's just not a politically viable policy in the United States at the current time, and Trump had nothing particularly personally to do with that. Next, Russia and Ukraine. So Trump expressed doubts about whether the United States should be strongly defending Ukraine, or doubts about the sanctions. He has been more positive rhetorically toward Russia than other leaders in the West, but nothing has changed in policy. The United States policy is still the same. We're still giving military aid to the Ukrainians. We're still backing the sanctions. Even if Trump wanted to change this policy personally, he can't in part because Congress won't let him, and in part because he is tarred by the brush of his close associations with Russia. Then there's Brexit. So Trump expressed strong support for the Brexiteers, even talked about signing a trade agreement with Britain. And it seemed like there might be an Anglo-American alliance against the European Union. But what's happened? Anybody could have told you that nobody signs a trade agreement with the United States in real time. You're crazy to try to sign a trade agreement with the United States, and if you do, it'll take you 15 years. And in fact, the United States has done the opposite. The Trump administration has hassled the British over bombardier jets, over agricultural goods. Imagine the trade negotiation if the British were actually trying to create an option with the United States, negotiating agriculture with the United States. And now he's fought in his second or third, I forget which it is, tweet battle with Theresa May. I just walked in and CNN was running the story about how the Prime Minister was Trump bashing. Then we have, which one is this? Oh yes, then we have NAFTA. So he said we were going to completely renegotiate NAFTA, that it was a bad treaty, the United States maybe should threaten to pull out of it. And what did the United States actually do? It picked two issues, steel and softwood lumber, to negotiate. Now, we've been negotiating almost continuously through the last 3 presidential administrations with Canada, softwood lumber and steel. Negotiating softwood lumber and steel imports from Canada is like an everyday occurrence in Washington always. There is nothing new about it, and it represents a way to seem as if you're doing something about NAFTA, whereas in fact there doesn't seem to be any will to do so within the administration. Then we have Mexico. So Trump mentioned that we were going to build a wall on the southern border, and Mexico was going to pay for it. So he went to the Mexican president, and the Mexican president basically told him, forget it. And now he is seeking appropriations from Congress to do that. It's unclear in the current fiscal environment how much money he's going to get. But the point is, when it comes to the foreign policy action of actually compelling Mexico to pay for something, it didn't happen at all. What's the next one? Then we have Israel. So Trump promised that he would move the capital to Jerusalem, but we don't hear anything about that anymore. It's non-viable. Then we have Iraq and Syria. So there, as well as to some extent in Afghanistan, Trump said that he was really going to take it to ISIS, bomb them heavily, do more. And there's a sense in which that's true. He has done a little bit more, really loosen the bonds on the military, the approval process so that they can bomb a little more. But that increase in bombing is not higher than the bombing was in the Obama administration in 2012. And in fact, if you look over time at a graph of how many air sorties are flown by the United States in these regions, it kind of goes up and down over time. So I would say it's maybe a minor change, but it's not in any way out of line with what American presidents have been doing of both parties over the last decade. Then we have Iran. So in this case, Trump chose a highly symbolic but completely meaningless policy. He was a vicious critic of the nuclear agreement with Iran, claimed he was going to scotch it in the first day of his administration. Instead, what he did months later was to decertify Iran's compliance with the agreement. Decertification is a nice legal term. It sounds important, but it actually doesn't do anything. It just states the intent of the president. If the United States wanted to take a meaningful foreign policy action in this area, Congress would have to take it, and it's very unclear that Congress has any intention of doing so. And having taken that symbolic action, he doesn't talk about it anymore, so it's hard to see that the Trump administration really has the will to do anything. Now that's the big circle. Then we have torture. So Trump, in lurid terms, talked about how he was going to change the United States' relationship to the Geneva restrictions on warfare, that the United States was now going to waterboard, and it was going to be a lot tougher than it had been before. That policy disappeared almost immediately in the new administration because the military is dead set against it, and because it really doesn't look good to be waterboarding and torturing people. And again, you don't hear anything more about it. The other big circle is climate change. This is a little bit like the Iran policy. Trump did take an action, which was to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, but that action has, as far as I can tell, absolutely no practical medium-term consequences. In the very long term, perhaps it does, because there could be agreements that emerge out of that process, but most people I know who study climate change think that if there's going to be a global agreement on climate change in the future, it will come out of some other process, not out of Paris. But the important point is, in the short term, that commits the United States to absolutely no policy change that is meaningless. Most of the action in the United States is taken by cities and states, or Congress anyway. So that's Trump's foreign policy in a nutshell. It is hard to find a single place in the world, a single policy of consequence that is different than what policy was a year ago. I would just offer a few caveats to that. I think the change in domestic foreign policy priorities, as it were, so the funding of, the decrease in funding of civilian foreign policy activity and the increase of military funding, though it's something any Republican president would do, it's not typical of Trump, is probably a meaningful change, more meaningful than any policy with regard to other countries. And we can talk about migration. That is migration into the United States. It's striking that the number of deportations from the United States has not risen since Trump went into office, but I think my fellow Americans, whether they're citizens or not, live in more fear than they used to because of this policy, so maybe that's something too. But when you look across the world at the way Trump really deals with other countries, you don't see much change. Now, this isn't just Trump, it's any populist foreign policy in a democratic country. And to give you another example of it, let's look at Brexit. So the argument is exactly the same. Whatever the future legal status of the EU, of the UK, whether it's a member of the EU or something like Norway, or cuts its own deal, the substantive policies associated with Brexit are unlikely ever to be implemented. This now, thanks to smart op-ed writers, goes under the name of the Hotel California effect. You can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. Okay, now, a lot of people think that's because these sneaky, terrible bureaucrats in Brussels force Britain to do things it doesn't want to do. It's exactly the opposite. It's basically because Britain doesn't want to leave, because it favors most of the policies. So let's just look at the Brexit negotiations. So number one, Britain doesn't seek to change about 95% of what the EU does. It's striking, even in the very first speech that May gave, which you'd think would be her extreme bargaining position, right? It was striking how much she conceded. We want to have single market regulations remain the same. We want access for services. All citizens of European countries now resident in Britain will be protected. We want homeland security and defense cooperation, et cetera, et cetera. They even want to be part of the Schengen information clearing arrangement, which they are now. So much of it doesn't change. So then what about the 5% they care about? So that's the status of migrants in the future in Britain, perhaps some customs union issues. Here, Britain needs bargaining power to change that because they are negotiating mano a mano with the Europeans, and they're much weaker than the Europeans are. Europe is a much higher proportion of British trade than vice versa. And they don't have the bargaining power to change many of those issues without paying a high price. So they might pick a couple and change them, but then they'll hurt themselves in doing so. Now you might say, as many British Eurosceptics say, yes, but we have alternatives. We will go out in the great world and we will sign trade agreements with the WTO, or we'll go to WTO, the US, China, or India. So I already talked about the United States. Anybody who thinks you can sign a mutually beneficial trade agreement with the United States is crazy. Signing one with China or India is even more of a struggle. But most importantly, each of these countries accounts for a relatively small portion of British trade. The United States, maybe about 10%, PRC in India about 5 and 4%. So you can't make up the trade access that you have for 50 or 55% of your trade, if you include services, in Europe by trying to expand a market that's only 4% of your trade. What's more, you can't just rely on the WTO, because the WTO doesn't protect service industries, which is Britain's largest exporter, and it doesn't protect agriculture, and people often forget that Britain's 5th largest export is agriculture. So Britain doesn't have any options. It's going to have to negotiate with the British, with the Europeans, and that is not going to go well for them. What's more, there domestically is not a popular or a parliamentary majority for a hard Brexit anymore. And a soft Brexit has come to mean essentially everything that the European Union already does with another name, which is what I'm arguing populists have to do anyway. Now, this would be threatening to the world and costly if other countries wanted to follow the British example, but only a crazy country would follow the British example, and that's why none of them are. So take somebody like Orban, who really is pretty extreme in terms of his populist political rhetoric. Orban is a smart guy. He runs a referendum against a European policy that to a first approximation doesn't even exist, which is to impose quotas on European countries for migrants. And even to the extent it did exist, it only ever affected 5 or 6% of migrants in Europe, and he leaves membership in Europe completely unchallenged, because only a crazy person in a place like the Czech Republic or Hungary or Poland would seek to pull out of the EU. You notice you never hear rhetoric from the populists that seriously raises that issue. So actually, the only remaining questions about Brexit are pretty small questions. Will Brexit happen at all? It's not clear that it will, given that this process is going to go on until 2022, 2023. What will be the legal form of the new relationship? Do they remain a member of the EU? Do they seek an arrangement like Norway or Switzerland or what? What few policies might the British be able to change, and what price will they pay for doing so, which generally almost certainly will leave Britain worse off? Another reason why this is not an example other countries want to follow. So that brings us to the final question: why? Why do populists keep failing? And relatedly, why do we perceive them as successful? Okay, now to answer this question, we need to ask ourselves, what is populism? All right, so populism is not making policy of, by, and for the people. Every politician does that, or should do that, or tries to do something like that. So did Abraham Lincoln, who wrote this phrase. It doesn't make them all populists. Nor is it just being right-wing or anti-migration or something like that. Otherwise, almost everybody in Europe today would be a populist, since there isn't much support for increasing migration in Europe. Instead, populism is a style of political rhetoric and justification. And it has 3 qualities. First, it dismisses expert and elite knowledge. It says experts don't know, the truth is simple, and the public can intuit it, and the politician will explain it to them. Secondly, it appeals to identity politics. So politics in the view of populists rests on communal beliefs and values, things like nation, religion, or ethnicity, or race even, not concrete calculations of interests. And third, related to this, it is anti-pluralist. The ideal policy solutions are preferable to compromise. You don't view politics as a way of reaching a messy compromise with a lot of dimensions between countries somewhere in the center. You seek to realize a pure policy. That is what populists promise people in elections. Now, here's the problem. Why do populist foreign policies fail? Because they have to be implemented. It's fine to promise this in an election. It's a whole different thing, as political scientists have studied for generations, to actually implement that policy. Why? Because those three things that are the basis of populist rhetoric turn out not to be true, right? So the first is politics isn't simple, it's complex. It's really complex, particularly foreign policy. Experts perceive lots of decisive details or trade-offs that normal people don't perceive, and when you're making policy, you have to face up to those. Secondly, it becomes concrete. It's easy to make electoral judgments or recommendations based on vague appeals to national or racial or ethnic sentiment. But making policy is very concrete. You start saying, we're going to do, NAFTA. We're going to cut imports of certain goods, and all of a sudden, special interests, government bureaucracies, people with even citizens with a real interest in the policy come out, and as a politician, you have to manage them. It becomes a messy, detailed process. And that process inevitably leads to compromise. When you implement policy, you never get everything you want. You're dealing with lots of different groups. So for these reasons, policy in general never, of a populist kind, never gets realized in its entirety. But it's particularly true of foreign policy. Because if you look at each of those factors, they're magnified when you talk about foreign policy. Foreign policy is really complex, and it involves lots of unfamiliar and counterintuitive things, the details of nuclear deterrence, what's going on in Iranian politics, the quid pro quos within NAFTA. These are not things that anybody but experts understands. Secondly, it becomes very concrete. The public drops out of most foreign policy issues because they just don't grasp the concrete details. So politicians have a different incentive. They seek to avoid really visible failures. So Obama doesn't want to leave Afghanistan because it will be clear he lost the war, and that looks bad. But other than that, it becomes the policy done by special interests, bureaucratic interests, special interest groups, and so on. These groups are very conscious, they're very focused, and they demand a very expert style of policymaking. And finally, there's compromise. This is perhaps the most important difference of international politics. International politics is carried out between sovereign states. You can't tell people in other countries what to do. You have to do a deal with them. So when Trump goes to the Mexican president just says, no, I don't want to be kicked out of office because you need a win, Mr. Trump. And Trump can do nothing about it except to use coercive force. He has the same problem in Korea. And coercive force is very expensive to use. So you end up compromising even more than you would in domestic politics. So my last slide and the last paradox. Why do people believe that populism is succeeding? So I believe I've shown that it hasn't succeeded in America, it hasn't succeeded in Britain, and that it can't succeed in America and it can't succeed in Britain. So why is it that I've been at this conference for a day and everybody has been talking as if foreign policy populism is succeeding? And I believe it's because they make exactly the same error that the populists do. They mistake talk for action. And let me talk about three groups who like to talk about talk rather than talking about what people do. The first, and probably most fundamental, is politicians themselves. So, of course, populist politicians want to talk as if they're achieving something. And in fact, you might argue that the best policy for Trump, the best policy outcome, is to appear to achieve something without actually having to pay the concrete costs of achieving that radical outcome, which would be difficult for him. But interestingly, opposition politicians have the same incentive. The Democrats in the United States play up Trump's absurdities, Trump's radicalness, because they're trying to mobilize their own base. So you get an echo chamber where nobody is saying that the emperor has no clothes. Journalists, commentators and policy analysts. So they report what politicians say. Sometimes they report what politicians do, but less often, because it's not daily news. And they never report what politicians do not do. The result is there are thousands of articles about Trump's tweets, very few articles about his policies, and no articles about what he did not do that he said he would do, except for the odd website that tracks these things, and maybe an article once a month in some publication. They also highlight worst-case speculation, not dull good news. Actually, the fact that things haven't changed is boring. Nobody buys a newspaper to read that. Final point, us, the scholars in the room. Scholars have a deplorable tendency to chase ambulances. In America, it's plaintiffs' lawyers who chase ambulances, but people who are interested in events chase ambulances too. And scholars have a tendency to want to be relevant, to want to be current, and they think the way to do that is to be like the journalists or be like the policy analysts and purvey the conventional wisdom based on what people say and not what they do. But the primary duty of a scholar is not that. The primary duty of a scholar is to craft research based on empirically tested medium-range analysis, to stand aside and above of policy, armed with theory and historical knowledge, and actually ask themselves whether long-term certain policies are sustainable. And if you take that standard and you look just at the last year, what you can see is that populist foreign policies pursued by democratic governments are doomed to fail. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. I think there was enough to provoke everybody one way or another in that, and so really thank you for setting the tone for today's discussions in general and in setting the tone for this discussion on this panel in particular. I think your framing of it as populist foreign policies in democratic countries being doomed to fail is a key point that I will perhaps pick up on later. But I will first like to give the floor to Nadine Goedhart of SVP. Then we'll turn to Gianpaolo Di Paola, and after that Matt Koenig, to comment on Andrew's excellent keynote speech. So Nadine, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, thank you for having me here again. And well, I maybe have two comments and then two questions. And the first comment is on Trump's policy and foreign policy, particularly turning to Asia, because even so you said he's not doing something, or he's even falling in line with what other administrations done before. One of the biggest changes really is that others maybe see the possibility to fill in the leverage and fill in the gaps that are left by Donald Trump's foreign policy. And particularly focusing on China and Japan, I would ask you if it's not the other way around, that these two countries, and particularly Abe, really knew how to play Trump in the first place. I mean, he was the first foreign leader meeting him in the Trump Tower even, and I think these two countries, particularly Xi Jinping and Abe, know how to outplay Trump's popular foreign policy and his tweeting diplomacy. Turning to Korea, I think what you said in the second part of your presentation, the symbolic and tweeting diplomacy that is also part of the populist foreign policy do make a difference here, because I think when we look at North Korea, we are really facing a situation that is even more worrying than 1994. We are really facing a situation where war is very likely happening, and this is not only because he is doing the same thing that maybe other administrations have done before, but also because he's not changing his style of tweeting and challenging in a different space, so to speak. The second comment is more general on the relationship between populism and democracy. I mean, you said that populism is a style of political rhetoric, and I would agree with it. I think it's not an ideology, that is very important. It's a political logic, but nevertheless, populism and democracy are also somehow inherently linked to each other. I mean, when we look at the European Union, many populist movements also, or maybe populist and protest movements also sort of turned up to be very important political parties afterwards. So there is an important link between populism and democracy, and I would like you to ask what this makes out of your your argument that populist foreign policy is doomed to fail, and maybe of the specific style of populism that you are talking about. The questions are maybe turning back to Europe a little bit, is that you were talking about two examples here, one also tackling Europe, but there are many other populist movements and parties in the European Union at the moment, and also in Germany we have the Alternative for Germany. And I would like you to probably talk a little bit about how you think these political parties have, if they have any kind of influence and impact on the EU foreign policy, because usually the EU foreign policy, migrants, Russia, the relationship to the US is a big part of their party program, so to speak. And I would also maybe challenge you a little bit in saying maybe these parties raise the right questions but have the wrong answers. So what can we do to actually answer them in the different way? And maybe the last question is again turning to Asia. I mean, you talked about democratic populist foreign policy, but of course there are also others, and we have Duterte in the Philippines, which is one of the examples that is also in a way playing with Trump on a same level. And what do you make out of this relationship when we turn to authoritarian states? Because when I look at the last slides of why our populist foreign policies are doomed to fail, you could easily exchange the word populism with authoritarian foreign policy then. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadine. Gianpaolo.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning to everybody. I will not do like Nadine, which is asking specific issue. I really would like to counter-provoke Andrew, because I think, first of all, populism, I really don't know what it is. You have done a definition. In general, we tend to say populist to whoever who disagree with us. This is in politics, not in policy. If I want to blame on you, if I want to be Machiavellic, and I have a Machiavelli expert and professor, so I don't dare to go any further on Machiavelli, but I want to be Machiavellic and to pursue power by any means, I say, you are a populist. By this way, I immediately blame you, and whatever you say, I don't have the justification or find the effort to justify why you are wrong. One. Two, if populists, as you say, they are doomed to fail because they do not achieve what they say in political campaign, well, I would say that there is populism all over the world, because there are many, and I could name it. I don't want to name because I don't want to enter into politics, but there are many political leaders, prime minister, and president in the world, including in Europe, including I'm not talking about Prague, believe me, but in the area, including my country, where there are a lot of political leaders who have not implemented a single bit of whatever they said, and they are not defined by good common sense as populists. Cameron, you would not define as a populist, and he failed completely. Theresa May, whatever he does, you don't define populist, and he tries to do what happened. So there are other populists who implement what they do. In Eastern Europe, in your vicinity, there is one populist, what by common sense we define populist, who is implementing badly his policy. So the issue is not if Trump or Theresa May or Brexit are populist. They are wrong policy. It's another stuff. Trump is making wrong policy, full stop, and not because he's a populist, because he's making wrong policy. I'm not defending Trump, although at all, I don't agree at all with Trump, although it looks very much, because now I have a quite familiarity with American environment, the name of the game is shooting to the pianist. And Mr. Trump is the pianist shooting to him, enter into saloon and shoot because he's good. Having said that, the point is there is a quantum, and I say in honor of Professor Derdenier, there is a quantum of populism in any political leader. The problem is how much quantum there is. So, because the problem is to pursue good politics, good policies, and make it, that policies coherent with politics, and that is the problem. That's because very often politics demand you do not pursue good policies because that will cost you political support. In Europe, you are populist if you challenge the common view that the present state of affairs in Europe, the present current way in which European Union is running its business is not correct, might be improved, might be changed, and then if you do that, you are populist. If for whatever reason, a number of millions of voters in UK and another country, and Nadine said, referring to Germany, I suppose, is going in a certain direction because they are populist. And so the issue is not just to blame you, you are populist, so I don't even have to take the effort to counter you, but try to counter that, or counter-argue. That's why you are wrong, I'm right. That is the issue. So I mean, this stuff, populism, I really don't like it at all. It doesn't help us. Policy is what matters. But you said another important thing, which I disagree totally, if I understood you correct. You said policies are interest. Come on. Policies are interest, but policies are also value. I mean, why we all European, we all NATO country, European countries say we are shared value and we cherish our value, want to defend our value because we believe in them. And so up to a point we defend them. If there is one nation, and not in Trump, but also in all the previous presidents, who when they speech, and I like the way they speech, they say, United States is a special country with a special destiny, with a special position in history. Is not that identity, is not value, and so that means Obama was a populist, Hillary Clinton was populist, Bush was a populist. Bush, you don't define Bush populist, he didn't implement anything, he did a lot of quite wrong mistake, a big mistake, we see the effort. So let's be honest here, and that is my point.
Thank you very much. A quantum of Gianpaolo Di Paola for really getting the discussion going. Thank you. Matt, over to you.
Well, first, thank you very much, Ben, for organizing this conference. It's always a pleasure to be back in Prague. And thanks to Professor Moravcsik for a provocative and clear presentation. In my remarks, I just want to make 5 points. First, I agree overall with Professor Moravczyk's conclusion that Trump is much more conventional than most people, I think, recognize. And in fact, I've been somewhat more sympathetic toward the administration than I think many foreign policy experts in Washington, precisely for this reason. And so Professor Moravcsik has said that many people mistake talk for action and talked about the different groups committing this error. I think one group that hasn't committed this error are establishment Republicans in Washington. And if you look at what people like Paul Ryan or former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, or at a much lower level myself has been saying over the past few months, it's been don't pay attention to what the president says or to what he's tweeting. Look at what the administration is doing. And what the administration is doing is actually pretty good. Second point, I think there has been continuity, but I don't know that that is the result of populist policies being hard to implement. I think continuity is the rule in foreign policy in general, for many of the reasons that Moravcsik pointed out. A lot of it is driven by the international environment. A lot of it is driven by bureaucratic and political elites. And so if we looked at the Obama administration, many of the things that Obama promised, he was unable to do, like close down Guantanamo Bay. So there was also continuity from Bush to Obama. Third, I would argue that there are several places where Trump's policy is an improvement over the Obama legacy, and that it's likely an improvement over what Hillary Clinton would have done. And in this category, I would put the Iran nuclear negotiations, North Korea policy, nuclear posture and missile defense, the war against ISIS. And so we probably don't have time in my opening remarks, but we can talk about it in the back and forth as to why I think there's actually been improvement. Now, I don't think this is specific to Trump or to populism. I think these are things that any conventional Republican president would have done, but I do think there's been some improvement. Fourth, on the ambiguity or on campaign promises, and has Trump followed through on his campaign promises, I think you could argue that in some areas he has. There's a lot of ambiguity in campaign promises. There's the saying in the United States that you govern in poetry, or campaign in poetry and govern in prose. But some of the things Trump has talked about, bombing the you-know-what out of ISIS, I think he's done. Renegotiate the Iran nuclear deal. I think he has taken steps in that direction. Build a nuclear arsenal that's, quote, top of the pack. I think he's taking steps in that direction. Renegotiate NAFTA. So again, on some of these campaign promises, I think he's taking the initial steps of following through. Fifth and finally, I just wonder if it's too early to judge. We're less than a year in. So if we looked at Obama's campaign promises less than a year in, he would have achieved, in foreign policy, he would have achieved almost none of them. He would have still been in the war in Iraq, still in the war in Afghanistan, hadn't shut down Guantanamo Bay, hadn't done anything yet on climate change, hadn't tracked down and killed bin Laden. Now, several years later, you could look back and say, well, he actually did accomplish quite a lot of what he said he was going to do during the campaign. And I think he did, but 1 year in, he hadn't really made much progress. So I'll stop there.
Matt, thank you very much indeed. I would add just two brief comments of my own, if I may abuse my chairing privilege for just a second. The first is on the link between populism and democracy, and the notion that words matter and that style matters. And I mean, Susan Sontag famously wrote about style, and she wrote about fascinating fascism and so on and so forth. And what I think we could see is that this style, even though it may not be a policy as such, is a practice. And that practice actually has the potential to undermine the very democratic foundations which you claim actually limit the success of populist foreign policy. So I think there's a more substantial fundamental threat that this actually poses than you're perhaps giving credit for. The second thing is about rationality. When talking about Brexit, I think you made a very good case for why some things won't change, but I was less convinced when you said that Britain won't do this because it is not in their interest. If that were the guiding principle, the whole Brexit vote wouldn't have happened in the first place. We wouldn't be talking about this. So it's not actually a question of being able to pursue interest in rational terms through these policy. And this is again connected to style. And when style becomes the substance, we are no longer talking about the pursuit of interest defined through that kind of action. And instead we set the tone for a very different kind of political game. So I would stop there and ask Andrew, can you respond to all of that, please?
So I want to thank all my colleagues for stiff challenges. Let's take them in reverse order. So Ben, does style matter? And what about the Brexit vote, for example? I think it's important to note that, at least in Trump's case, and this speaks to Matt's point too, it's not that Trump sort of hasn't gotten around to thinking about and realizing policies that he might do. It's that he has already decided to do the opposite in many of these cases, strikingly the opposite. And campaign promises may be vague, but Trump's weren't that vague, actually. And there may be the odd areas, mostly areas where every Republican favors the same thing, like increasing military spending and reducing civilian spending on foreign policy, where Trump is going to deliver. But the distinctively Trumpian and distinctively populist things that he promised, he has already decided not to do. Now this speaks again to the difference between, I've forgotten it's a cliche every American knows, but I'd forgotten the campaign in poetry and govern in prose thing. This is kind of a corollary to that claim. It's true that if you create an election issue around a foreign policy issue, as the British did with the referendum, you will generate populist behavior. It's an institutional fact. And were foreign policies to be primarily made by referenda, we'd be in big trouble. But they aren't in the United States. They aren't for the foreseeable future in Europe going to be. And making sustainable policy
Sustainable policy is something that is not done by referendum. It's done by bureaucrats and interests and broad, actually committed public opinion. So it's true that you can get yourself into bad situations because populist style or bad institutions create problems. But policy then has a tendency, a gravitational tendency to revert to basic interests. So now going to Matt, I already discussed the issue of ambiguity. I mean, I think Trump is really committed to now an establishment foreign policy in many respects. Whether or not he's an improvement or not over what Clinton would have done strikes me as a very speculative thing. Speaking as a Democrat, the criticism of Clinton was that she was too much of a militarist, too active in her foreign policy. You should vote for Bernie Sanders because he's the real Democrat who's more isolationist. So the idea that she would not have done anything about Iran or anything about North Korea or even anything about ISIS seems to me a bit far-fetched. But I do agree that establishment Republicans happen to have, for politically expedient reasons, been more correct about this than other things. Now to Gianpaolo. He's right. The United States in general in this respect, I hadn't really thought about it until we discussed it just before this panel and now, it is a more populist country in a certain sense, and that sense is that the United States has a more developed sense of nationalism in the our policy is better sense than other countries. That's just a statistical fact. Actually, if you look at the polling, you ask how many Americans say that their institutions are better than anybody else's or that they should spread their institutions, and it's 2 or 3 times higher than it is in almost any other country in the world. And I think it's true about political style as well, that Americans tend to talk about American exceptionalism explicitly, even celebrate it. And so I think there's something to the claim that every American president is a little bit given to making claims that they're not going to fulfill. But Trump is the archetype of this, right? He is the person who only makes claims of this kind, and therefore he's the person who's going to fail a lot more than anybody else. And similarly, Gianpaolo's claim that we, all politicians compromise, all politicians don't get what they want. But not all politicians, and that's in the nature of politics, as I argued in the presentation, but not all politicians don't even try to achieve the policies that they seek, don't even compromise on them, just immediately sell out to the opposing point of view. That I can't really think of a clear example of that in American politics recently. But I think we're very much on the same page in saying that, the goal here is to pursue good policies, and if an administration pursues good policies, I care less what they say. As for Nadine, I'm going to use your comments, which I thought are great, to highlight 3 limitations of this Trump is okay because he's not doing what he says view, right? First, and this relates to your point about Japan and China filling the void left by the United States. I think there is very little danger that Trump will do things in terms of policy implementation that we don't want him to do. But there is a danger that he will not do things that we do want him to do. If you're a populist and you find that you can't achieve any of your stuff, and particularly if you have a populist style of governance, which involves not having experts on staff, it's very hard actually to initiate policy. And so one worries sometimes that the Trump administration will not do things. We could tell stories. I think many people in the room probably have dealt with people who deal with the Trump administration, and there's some pretty scary stories about what they don't know or don't care about in the White House nowadays. Second limitation, which speaks to your point about Korea. It's true that in the normal process of policy implementation, it's very hard for a populist president to force through his view. But sometimes presidents, and particularly presidents of the United States, a military power, are faced with crisis situations where they have to make decisions very quickly And as we know from, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, what the president thinks matters in those cases. His instincts, and it's not entirely clear that Trump's instincts would be sound put under stress. Certainly that isn't what it seems from the tweets, but you never know what the status of tweets really is. The third limitation, which I alluded to in the talk, and nobody mentioned, but actually I think it might be the most important shift, Matt did briefly, is resourcing policy. So I do think that funding priorities in the United States will shift, again, not because of Trump, but more because we have a Republican government. I'm not in favor of those funding priorities as a Democrat, moving money to the military, spending money on nuclear weapons, rather than civilian power, but I think they're real. And they do have an effect over the long term on policy. You could even argue, pursuant to a conversation that Dan Nixon and I had last night, that the domestic policies Trump pursues, the tax policies, the defunding of education and so on, could have an important effect on the United States. I hadn't thought about that either, but Dan convinced me that that really makes sense. Finally, Europe. Nadine said quietly, but quite provocatively, I think, maybe the populists are asking the right questions, they're just giving the wrong answers in Europe. And I think there's a case to be made for that. I think migration is an issue, for example, where there really isn't a sustainable majority, as I mentioned in the discussion yesterday. Sustainable majority for open migration, the populists have raised that question, and other parties are going to have to deal with it one way or another, not because populists raised it, but because most of the population wants something done. And anybody who lives, for example, in Italy knows that this is the case. I do think that addressing some of these broader issues that underlie populist claims and crafting real policy solutions is an important imperative for all of us. So even if we don't believe that populists are going to make good on their claims, we should attend to their discourse.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. Themes that have been raised in this discussion will continue to be talked about throughout the day, I'm quite sure, as it's really set a fantastic tone for our critical questioning of what the big issues that we face today are. What is the role of particular leaders? What is the stability of our order, and so on? And in fact, that's the next discussion that we have coming up about whether we are living in a new world disorder or in fact entering an era of post-order geopolitics. And the role of populism is clearly one of the main factors in that. A brief scheduling note that we're running about 10 minutes behind schedule, so there will be time to grab a quick coffee before we hit the next panel. But first of all, I would just like to highlight, Andrew Moravczyk's career going in and out of policy, of journalism, as well as scholarship, highlights in many ways the rationale of this conference, and bringing him together with the wonderful speakers that we've also had on the panel with Gianpaolo Di Paola, Nadine Godhart, and Matt Kranig, again highlights the kind of conversations that we want and need to have about bringing the great ideas from academia and questioning those to policymakers, to practitioners, and also getting academics to interact with those policymakers and practitioners to give us a better sense of what the challenges they face are, and not just go chasing ambulances, as I think Andy wonderfully put it. I'd also very quickly like to thank our sponsors and partners who've made it possible for us to bring Professor Andrew Moravcsik from Princeton University here. So many, many thanks again to the Czech Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, to the Institute for Democracy 21, to VR Musashi, and to the embassies who have kindly supported us in bringing many of our speakers here. We hope that you agree that this is a very stimulating discussion and important discussions to continue having. So we hope that this will not only be the first Prague Insecurity Conference, but it will set the tone for our future Prague Insecurity Conferences. And the very last note from me on that is to also thank the Munich Security Conference for indeed the support they have given to us and the advice they've provided. Because we do indeed seek to contribute to their discussions as well as they contributing to ours. And thank you once again to Andrew Moravcsik and to our panelists for setting the tone for the day. Please join me in thanking them.